We sold it, Dad. Just 4 words, but they felt like an axe blade splitting my life in two. They said it with quiet voices, without blinking, without a shred of shame. I just sat there in that old wooden chair, the same one that had seen so many family dinners, staring at my 2 sons, my own blood, declaring, as if it were nothing, that this house, the one I built with my own 2 hands all those years ago, wasn't mine anymore. I heard every syllable, every breath, but my mind refused to believe it. Outside, the wind rustled the wisteria by the porch and lifted the curtain my wife had sewn. In that small movement, I watched my whole life fall apart. My name is Arthur Johnson. I'm 84 years old, and I've just lost not only my roof but my memory, my faith in what's sacred, the love between a father and his sons. I tried to ask, my voice cracking, a knot in my throat. "What did you say, boys?" Charles, the older one, just shrugged like it was all settled. "We sold it, Dad. The house was worth a lot. We already signed everything." Andrew, the younger one, just looked at me with those eyes cold as ice. He said nothing. He just nodded, as if talking was a waste of time. Not one apology. Not one question about where I'd live, or what I'd eat, or how I'd get by. I looked around. The walls stained by the years, the scratched table where Mary, my wife, used to sew. Every corner held our fingerprints. This place wasn't just a house. It was my whole life. The place where I heard my first son's first cry. The place where I said goodbye to Mary as the church bells tolled. I put my trembling hands on the arm of the chair, not from age, but from betrayal. Everything I'd believed in, that your children would care for you in your old age, crumbled like cold ash. I wanted to scream, to pound the table, to ask why. But the voice wouldn't come. They just stood there, waiting to see how I'd react, as if this was all just simple paperwork. I turned away, not from weakness, but because I knew if I looked at them 1 second longer, I'd break down. And I wasn't going to cry in front of my sons. I walked slowly to my room and closed the door. The walls seemed to sigh with me. From the bed I could hear them laughing, talking about moving, about money, about their new lives. No one mentioned my name. I closed my eyes, clutching the key to the house that hangs around my neck. The only thing that's still mine. Under this wrinkled skin, my heart was still beating. Weak, but steady. They think all that's left for me is to wait for death. That this old man will just sit in a corner and weep. But they're wrong, because there's something only I know. A secret I never told anyone, not even Mary. Something they can't sell or steal or understand. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But that night, in the silence of my room that felt like a tomb, I made a promise to myself. My sons are going to learn that this old father isn't beaten yet. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. Before everything broke, my life had been simple and full of light. Every morning, before the sun pushed through the linen curtains, the smell of Mary's coffee already filled the kitchen. The sizzle of bacon in the pan, her soft voice humming along to an old love song on the radio. That was the sound of peace. I still remember it clearly. This house wasn't born from luck. It was born from 10 years of hard work, of cracked hands and long afternoons, coming home covered in dust and iron. We raised every wall with bricks I mixed with my own hands. There were no masons or architects, just the 2 of us, Mary and me, and the belief that one day this place would be a real home. When I finally nailed the last shingle, I sat on the porch, exhausted, watching Mary wipe the sweat from her forehead, and she laughed. "We've got a real roof over our heads now, Arthur," she said. She just smiled, with that look full of pride. The apple tree in the yard, I planted it the day Charles was born. Back then, it barely came up to my knee. Now, its shadow covers the whole porch. Every season, when the apples got ripe, my 2 boys would run around, shouting and fighting over the first one. Mary would pretend to be angry. "Leave a few for your father, boys." But she always hid a couple behind her back and gave them to me later, in secret, like a prize. I always thought happiness was something simple. A table where someone is waiting for you. A roof where you can hear the sound of children's laughter. Nothing more. I didn't need riches. Just to hear someone call me Dad and mean it. I believed that my whole life. When Mary died, the house became so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the clock. The first few days, I'd still set an extra plate at the table, a small teacup, as if she were still sitting with me. I hung the curtains she loved back up, and I left the chair where she sewed untouched. Some said I was holding on too tight. But for me, keeping those little details was my way of keeping her alive. I don't know when this house became a part of my body. Every crack in the wall holds a story. Every floorboard holds the footprints of my sons. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I'd wake up to the sound of a leak in the roof, and instead of being annoyed, I'd smile. It was me who had climbed up to fix it years ago. For me, this house wasn't just a shelter. It was the witness to my entire life. The place where I learned to love, to be a father, to lose. That's why, when I heard them say, "We sold it," it felt like someone had set my entire past on fire. That night, in the room that still held the faint smell of Mary's clothes, I touched the old frame of a photo and whispered, "Mary, they've taken our house, but they can't take this." The night wind moved the curtain, soft like a nod, and I understood that Mary could still hear me, somewhere in the corners of these walls that hold our souls. There are afternoons when, sitting alone on the porch, my mind wanders back to the years when my sons were small. In those days, all my worries would disappear with a simple phrase, "Dad, come play." Charles and Andrew were smart kids, mischievous, but good-hearted. They'd fight over who got to hold the hammer and strike the anvil in my little workshop, copying my movements as I forged the iron, and they'd laugh like crazy when the sparks flew. Every night, I'd give them their bath, and the three of us would huddle under the old quilt while I told them stories about the men who built cities, about honesty, and the value of hard work. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Charles?" "I want to be like you, Dad. Build houses for people." I laughed with pure joy. Even Andrew, barely 5 years old, promised me, "I'll never let you work alone." Those words still echo in my head, like distant bells ringing every time night falls. I believed with all my heart that I had taught them to love, to value what their parents gave them. But life doesn't just teach with words. It also teaches with temptation. And the human heart forgets easily when the light of money shines. While Mary was alive, everything was warm and whole. She was the invisible thread that held us together. She understood my silences, my worries I never spoke aloud. When I was too strict with the boys, Mary would just touch my shoulder and say, "Let them learn with love, Arthur." And she was always right. Our sons grew up in peace. They went to school, got good jobs, started their own families. I thought I'd done my duty. But after her death, the space between us began to widen. The visits became less frequent, and when they did come, they brought words that, at first, seemed harmless. "Dad, this house is too big. Why live alone in a place like this? If you sell it, you could be more comfortable. We'll take care of everything." At first I'd laugh. I'd tell them this house was their mother's legacy, the place where she still lived. But their eyes weren't the same. They no longer held pride. They held calculation. One afternoon, Charles put his hand on my shoulder and, in a voice that was half pity, half condescending, said, "Dad, you don't need to cling to this. It's just bricks and shingles." I looked at him for a long time before answering in a low voice, "You're right, son. Just bricks and shingles. But they're the bricks I laid, and the shingles your mother picked out. They're the breath of a whole life." Andrew, who was standing nearby, gave an uncomfortable smile. I remembered that smile perfectly. It wasn't joy. It was embarrassment, like someone who's already thought of something they shouldn't say. I didn't blame them. I didn't raise my voice. I just felt a small chill inside my chest. Maybe when someone gets too far from the roof that sheltered them, they forget its smell, and they also forget the hands that built it. That night I stood in the yard, looking at the apple tree that was now taller than the roof. The leaves rustled, sounding like Mary's whisper. You gave them too much. Maybe she was right. The day they said those 4 words, "We sold it, Dad," hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been planted long before, in those looks, in that advice disguised as caring. And I, blind with love, didn't see it coming. I whispered into the darkness, "Mary, maybe I taught them how to live, but I didn't teach them how to love." I still clearly remember that afternoon when Charles first spoke in earnest about selling the house. We were sitting on the porch. It was July. The air was dry, and the sun cast a golden light on the old bricks that Mary used to sweep every morning. Charles took a sip of his coffee. He looked around, and with a calm that unsettled me, he said, "Dad, if you sell this house, you could live more comfortably. At your age, it doesn't make sense to keep up a place this big." I looked at him, thinking he was joking, but his eyes weren't joking. Andrew was leaning against the pillar, silent, playing with his phone. "I've already run the numbers," Charles continued. "We'll handle the paperwork. You don't have to worry about a thing. We're just thinking of what's best for you." I set my cup down on the table, slowly. "What's best for me? And what about your mother's soul? What about all the years saved between these walls?" Charles smiled coldly. "Memories don't put food on the table, Dad. You should try to be more realistic." Realistic? That word cut through me like a sharp blade. Since when are feelings measured by the value of money? They kept talking, insisting with that soft but icy voice. I just listened. Every sentence landing like the ground in the garden was cracking open. That night, after they left, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence was so deep I could hear my own heart. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't angry. I just went to my room and opened the drawer where I keep the old photos. In one of them, Mary is standing between our 2 boys, with her serene smile and her hand on Charles's shoulder, as if trying to hold him back. I touched her face in the picture and murmured, "Mary, they're forgetting that this house was built with love." From that day on, I started to notice other signs. Quick phone calls just to ask if I had the deed to the house in order. Visits where their eyes scanned the living room, more than my face. When I mentioned I wanted to fix the leaky roof, Charles replied, "Don't spend the money, Dad. After all, who knows how much longer you'll be here?" That sentence froze me. It wasn't just carelessness. It was preparation. A calculated step towards something they had already decided. I started to suspect. Every time they left, I watched them from the window. They'd talk in low voices, then look back at the house with the interest of someone appraising an item for sale. That look made my skin crawl. One night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the yard and sat under the apple tree, the same one that had held the laughter of my boys when they were children. The wind moved the leaves, and in their murmur, I thought I heard Mary's voice. "You gave them too much." Maybe she was right. I gave them everything. My love, my effort, my trust. And in return, I received calculation and coldness. I sighed, looking at the reflection of the moon on the roof. In that moment, I knew I was at a crossroads in my old age. Keep trusting, or prepare for the betrayal. And with the infallible premonition of a father, I understood that the worst hadn't happened yet. But it was very close. That morning, the sky was clear and cool. It seemed like any other day. I got up early, made coffee, and went out to the yard to give breadcrumbs to the sparrows. The first rays of sun were hitting the red roof I had put up with my own hands, right alongside Mary. I'd never seen my house look so beautiful, and I never imagined it would be the last morning I could call it home. Around 9, the screech of the iron gate broke the silence. I thought it was a neighbor coming by to say hello. So I wiped my hands on my apron and went out, but no. It was Charles and Andrew, standing there, serious, dressed well, their faces hard. There were no hugs, no good morning, just a slight nod. "Is something wrong, boys?" I asked, feeling a bitter premonition. Charles looked around and let out a sigh, like someone preparing for something difficult. "Dad, it's better if you sit down. We want to be clear about things today." I didn't have time to react before Andrew stepped forward, his voice dry. "We sold it, Dad." I thought I'd misheard. "Sold what?" "The house," Charles answered without hesitation. "Everything is signed. The buyer is coming next week." I froze. The coffee cup trembled in my hand and spilled, the hot liquid spreading across the ground. The smell of fresh coffee, mixed with the bitterness, rising in my chest. I looked them in the eyes. There wasn't a shadow of remorse. "What right do you have?" I managed to say. "This is your mother's house, yours and mine." Charles cut me off, his tone soft but icy. "Dad, you're getting old. Living alone in a place this big isn't safe. We just want what's best for you. With the money from the sale, you'll have enough to live comfortably." I let out a hoarse, broken laugh, like the creak of old wood. "Enough to live? And enough to remember your mother?" No one answered. Andrew looked away, toward the yard, where the apple tree was barely moving in the wind. That tree I planted the day Charles was born. I tried to stay calm. "Do you think selling this house ends everything? What price do you put on the laughter, the shared meals, the memories your mother left in every corner?" Charles shrugged. "I don't want to argue. It's all signed. Just get your things. The buyer is coming for the keys in a few days." I felt the world crumble around me. The walls, the windows, the furniture. Everything seemed to pull away, sinking into shadow. In that instant, I understood that between them and me, there was nothing left but cold, foreign blood. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I simply turned around, walked to my room, and closed the door. From inside, I heard their voices, their footsteps, a short laugh when they mentioned the money, and then the sound of the front door closing. The house returned to silence, broken only by the rustle of the wind in the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the room I had shared with Mary for 40 years. Our wedding portrait seemed to tremble on the wall, and in her eyes, I thought I saw the same sadness I felt. "You see, Mary," I whispered, "in the end I've lost everything." But in that emptiness, a small flame lit inside me, weak but steady. They think they've taken everything from me. But they don't know that there are things this old man keeps in silence, not to hide, but to protect himself. The day they left, I stood by the door, watching the 2 moving trucks loaded with their things pull away down the dusty road. The sound of the engines faded, leaving behind a thick emptiness, a silence that hurt. The house was still, too still. I walked inside slowly. Everything was the same. The furniture, the pictures, the smell of old coffee. But something essential was gone. The human breath. I didn't cry. Maybe when the pain goes that deep, tears don't exist. That afternoon, I went to the post office near the market and rented a small room in an old working-class neighborhood. It barely fit an iron cot, a wobbly table, and a window that looked out onto a gray brick wall. No one asked where I came from or who I was. The landlady, a middle-aged widow, just said, "It's quiet here, sir, but don't expect conversation." I nodded. I didn't need words anymore, just a roof to spend the night under. That first night I stared at the water-stained ceiling. The sounds of the street, distant motors, scattered barking, mixed with the echo of my own breathing. I felt like a ghost, lost in the same city I used to call home. I opened the small bag I'd brought. A couple of shirts, the photo of Mary, the old key to the house, and the 2 porcelain teacups she used every morning. I set them on the table. One for her, one for me, and an empty space for the memories. I sat in silence for a long time. In my head, my son's voice still echoed. "We sold it, Dad. Don't fight it." I wondered if, wherever she was, Mary could see me now. If she could hear the clumsy beat of my heart in this foreign room. In the hallway, the rain began to beat on the tin roof. I smiled bitterly. The sky seemed to take pity on me, crying the humiliation I couldn't express. I lay down. The sagging mattress creaked under my weight. The smell of dampness, of old paint, of loneliness, wrapped around me like an icy blanket. At midnight, a dream woke me. I was standing in our old house, and I heard Mary's voice calling me. "Arthur, don't let them take your soul." I woke with a start, sitting up in the darkness. Only the yellow light of the street lamp filtered through the crack in the door. I put my hand on my chest and murmured, "No, Mary, they can take the house, but not my soul." At dawn, I made coffee in an old aluminum kettle. The smell, toasted and slightly burnt, reminded me I was still alive. I went to the window with the cup in my hands, looking at the raindrops on the bars, and I understood. I wasn't afraid of poverty or loneliness. What terrified me was being forgotten, erased from the memory of those I had nourished with my whole life. Then I remembered what no one else knew. The money I had saved in silence for decades. The small plot of land out of town I had never mentioned to anyone. I don't know why I kept it a secret. But that morning, I understood it had become my lifeline. I took a sip of cold coffee and said to myself in a low voice, "They think their old man is finished, but this game is just beginning." The third night in the boarding house, I couldn't sleep. The wind whistled through the crack in the door, and the tin roof rattled with an irregular rhythm, as if mocking the tired beat of my heart. I stared at the gray, damp ceiling, with one image in my mind. Mary, her hair pulled back, her sweet gaze, and those hands that always smelled like fresh bread. Since she'd been gone, I'd never dreamed of her, until that night. In the dream, Mary was standing by the window, a soft light illuminating her face. She was wearing the blue floral dress I gave her for our 30th anniversary. She looked at me without sadness or blame, just a small smile. "Arthur," she said, her voice like the wind, "don't let them take your soul." I woke with a start, my back soaked in sweat. The rain was still falling outside, a slow rhythm, as if the sky were murmuring words of the dead. I sat up, opened my cloth bag, and took out our wedding photo, yellowed with age. In it, Mary was smiling, and I, young, had a look full of pride. I ran my fingers over the trembling edge of the photo, afraid of breaking that smile. "Mary, am I too weak?" I whispered. "They sold our house, the garden where you planted flowers, the window where you hung your handmade curtains. I thought I had lost everything, but tonight I understand that we still have each other in the memories." I put the photo on the table, next to the 2 porcelain teacups. I filled one with hot water, the other I left empty. The steam mixed with the damp smell of the room, and for me, that scent was the smell of the happy years. Outside, the light from the street lamp came through the window, leaving a golden strip on the floor. In that strip, I thought I saw the silhouette of Mary sitting, knitting, looking up every so often to ask, "Still working so late, Arthur?" The question echoed in my mind, softening something inside me. Then I remembered the secret I never even told her, the money I'd been saving in silence since my days as an iron worker in Pittsburgh. Back then, I was only thinking of securing a future for her and the boys. But now I understood that money would serve another purpose, not to survive, but to reclaim my dignity. I leaned my head against the wall and sighed. "Mary, I think I understand now. Justice doesn't come from shouting. It comes with patience. Like when you used to plant in the garden. You just had to wait, and the flowers always ended up blooming. In that instant, I felt something strange. There was no more anger, no resentment, just a deep calm, like the sound of the rain. I understood that Mary was still with me, not to console me, but to remind me that my story wasn't over yet. I turned off the light and lay back down. I listened to the rain fade to nothing, and next to my ear, like a sigh, I heard her voice tell me, "There is still justice, Arthur, but do it calmly." And I knew then that when the sun came up, I would start over, not for revenge, but to live in a way that what Mary believed of me would remain intact. The next morning, when the first rays of sun slipped through the crack in the window, I was already awake. The room was still in shadow, but inside me, something had been lit. Mary's words from the night before still echoed, "Don't let them take your soul." Maybe the time had come to do what I had put off for so many years, to open the past and use it as a starting point. I sat at the table and took a cluster of old keys from my bag. Among the rusty ones was a small one, useless to anyone else, but it was the most valuable thing I owned. The key to the safety deposit box at the bank in Pittsburgh, where I had worked so many years ago. More than half a century back, when I was barely in my 20s, I left my hometown to look for work up north. Back then, Mary was still living with her parents, waiting for me with the promise of, "When I have enough money, I'll come back for you." Life was hard. I worked as an iron worker under a burning sun, my hands blistered, my back scorched by the sparks from the metal. But every night, I wrote her a letter, telling her my dreams. "I'll build you a house with a window facing east, so the sun comes into the kitchen." Every morning, I started saving from my very first paycheck, putting aside a small amount every month. It wasn't much, but I never touched it. When it was enough, I deposited it in the bank in my name. Nobody knew, not even Mary. It wasn't a secret born of mistrust. I just wanted to surprise her one day and say, "See, I kept my promise." The years passed. We got married. We built a house. We raised our sons. We lived on work and faith. And I kept up the habit. Every time I took an extra job or fixed a machine for a neighbor, I put a part of it away. It was a piece of my life, saved in silence. When Mary died, I almost withdrew it all to give her a grand funeral. But I stopped, not out of greed, but because deep down, I heard her voice. "Only use it when you have to, Arthur." I never imagined how necessary it would be now. That afternoon, I went to the bus station and bought a ticket to Pittsburgh. During the long ride, I thought about my sons. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a kind of gray emptiness, like ashes after a fire. They believed their father was a poor old man. Nothing left but memories. They just didn't know. When I arrived at the bank, the smell of polished wood and the echo of shoes on the marble floor hit my chest. I gave them my documents. The manager checked them and smiled. "Mr. Arthur Johnson, it's been a long time. Your box is still intact." I nodded in silence. When the metal door swung open, the light reflected off the old passbook savings, the deed to the land on the outskirts of town, and a few yellowed handwritten pages. It was all there, as if time had stopped. I ran my fingers over each document, feeling a coldness that somehow comforted me. "Mary," I murmured to myself. "See? I kept my word." I closed the box and smiled, tired but at peace. I knew that from this day on, that secret would stop being a simple safeguard for the future. It would become the key to getting my dignity back. A quiet justice, just as Mary had taught me. Do it calmly. I returned from Pittsburgh 2 days later with an envelope full of documents and a strange peace in my chest. The road was long. The sun filtered through the bus window, and the dry wind swept across the golden fields. I watched the horizon, in no hurry. In more than 80 years of life. It was the first time I felt so light. Not because of the money, but because I knew I still had the power to choose. I didn't go back to the boarding house. I rented a little house on the edge of town, whitewashed walls, a light blue tin roof, a single room, and a small yard covered in grass. It had no history, no memories, but it offered me something more valuable: silence. No one knew who I was. No one said my name with pity. The first day I opened all the windows to let the sun in. The new air smelled like freedom, so different from the damp confinement of the rented room. I hung up Mary's wedding photo, set the 2 porcelain teacups on the table, and planted a young apple tree in the corner of the yard, a small sapling I'd brought from, a slip I'd found. As I covered its roots with soil, my hands trembled, but my heart burned warm. I murmured, "This time, Mary, we're going to plant a new life." The days passed, and I started to get used to the new rhythm. Every morning, I'd make coffee and sit on the porch to watch the sun wash over the neighbors' roofs. The people in the neighborhood were kind. Everyone waved. A woman who sold fresh-baked goods, Mrs. Gable, always stopped at my gate. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. How are you today?" "Doing well, ma'am. Better than yesterday." We'd laugh. Just that. But for me, it was the first human sound that warmed me inside again. In the afternoons, I'd walk to the market and buy little things: a used tablecloth, a rusty clock, an oil lamp. I didn't need much, just enough to give the place a soul. At night, I'd light the lamp and watch the yellow light reflect on the walls. In that dimness, I could almost see Mary smiling, like when she used to sew shirts by the window. One night, I opened the envelope I brought back from Pittsburgh. The documents were pristine. I spread them on the table: savings books, the deed to the land, figures I had never bothered to count. I didn't feel joy for the money. I felt freedom, something I had forgotten for a long time. I wrote a sentence in my notebook: "They can take my house, but not the will of the man who built it with his hands." The next few days, I lived just like that, in peace. In the mornings, I watered the apple tree. In the afternoons, I listened to the radio. I started to write about Mary, about my son's childhood, about that old house. As I wrote, I wasn't trembling. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't doing it to complain, but to leave a record of an honest life. And when I saw the first new leaves sprout on the young apple tree, I smiled. I knew my life hadn't ended in that boarding house. I had pulled myself out of the humiliation and was standing once again on my own 2 trembling feet. The evening sky turned a soft orange. I poured another cup of coffee, leaned back in the chair, and spoke to the wind. "Mary, I've started over, not for revenge, but to keep living. For you, for me, and for the dignity we planted together." Once I felt settled in the new house, I knew I couldn't live just on memories. Every morning, after watering the young apple tree in the yard, I sat with a cup of coffee to think about the future. Not my future. At my age, the road ahead isn't long, but the future of my legacy. I had worked and saved in silence my whole life, not to see that effort fall into the hands of sons who didn't know its value. Now I had to make sure that what I'd built served a worthy purpose. One Monday morning, I went to visit Mr. Henderson, the lawyer who had helped me buy the land years ago. He was older, but he still had his deep voice and the sharp gaze of a man seasoned by the years. When he saw me, he stood up, surprised, and shook my hand. "Arthur Johnson, how long has it been? I heard you retired long ago." "Yes," I replied, smiling sadly. "I retired. I lost my house, and I almost lost my faith. But there's one last thing I need your help with." Henderson offered me a seat, poured some tea, and got straight to the point. "Are you looking to make a will?" I nodded. "Yes, but not a typical one. I don't plan on leaving my sons anything. Everything: the land, the money, the accounts. I want to donate it to a home for abandoned elderly. Do you know a reliable one?" The lawyer looked at me for a long time before asking, "Are you sure? No one in your family will receive anything?" "I gave them my whole life, Mr. Henderson. Now I just want what's left to go to those who value a hot plate of food." Henderson nodded and began taking notes in his legal pad. He promised to prepare everything so that no one could contest it. When I left the office, I felt like a stone had been lifted from my chest. For the first time in years, I was the master of my own destiny. That afternoon, I went to visit a place called the St. Jude's Home on the outskirts of the city. The place was modest, no luxuries, but it was full of laughter. Some of the old folks were knitting, others were playing chess, and a few were reading on the porch. The director, a gray-haired man named Mr. Wallace, met me with a firm handshake. "We live on the kindness of people, Mr. Johnson," he said. "Nobody here has much, but everyone shares." I walked down the hall and saw the walls covered in small plaques with the names of those who had helped build the place. I stopped in front of them and smiled. "Maybe, when I'm gone, I'd like my name to be here too," I said softly. "Not so I'll be remembered, but so someone else can have a roof over their head." On the way home, the sunset bathed the sky in a honey color. I opened my door, sat on the porch, and watched the apple tree. Its leaves were greener than ever, whispering as if Mary were laughing in the wind. "You did good, Arthur." I thought I heard her voice, sweet, in the gusts. I took a sip of cold coffee and wrote in my notebook. "Justice isn't revenge. Justice is making something right flourish in the very place where it was once trampled." That night I slept deeply, which was rare for me. In my dreams, Mary was by my side, her gaze serene, and I understood that I had chosen the right path, the path of quiet justice. No noise, but with a soul at peace. Life in the little house was quieter than I'd imagined. At first, it was hard to get used to. I missed the sound of Mary's footsteps in the kitchen, the laughter of the boys in the yard. But little by little, everything took on the rhythm of a new normal. Every morning, I'd make coffee, open the windows to let the light in, and sit on the porch step to watch the young apple tree stretch its leaves. Sometimes a few sparrows would land on its branches, chirping as if they were mocking me. "Yep, old man, you're still here." And I'd laugh to myself. Yes, I was still here, still breathing. And more importantly, I still had my dignity. I got used to the neighborhood. No one knew my past. They just knew I was a quiet old man who loved black coffee and bought sweet rolls every afternoon. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the little corner store, always called me Mr. Johnson with respect. One day, she brought me a hot casserole and asked, "Do you live all alone, sir?" "Yes, ma'am, but I'm not lonely. My company is time." She smiled and left the casserole without charging me. That simple act warmed me more than the sun. At noon, I'd usually walk to the nearby park. An old man named Peter, who sold fruit from a cart, would wave to me. "Mr. Johnson, I saved you some sweet oranges." I'd buy a few, and we'd sit under a tree and talk. We talked about life, about the wives who were gone, about the children who rarely called, about the years of work that no one remembers. Between two old men with nothing left to lose, honesty flowed freely. In the afternoons, when the sun dipped low, I wrote in my notebook. Every line was like a sigh. I wrote about Mary, about my sons, about the pain that still ached, but no longer weighed me down. It wasn't to complain. It was to remind myself that even sadness, if you write it down, becomes lighter. One night, I turned on the radio and an old song came on, Unchained Melody. Instantly, I saw Mary's eyes on our wedding day. Tears sprang to my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. Because for the first time, I wasn't crying for the loss. I was crying because I was starting to live again. I went back to the St. Jude's home several times. Each visit, Mr. Wallace greeted me like an old friend. He showed me a new room under construction, telling me that the latest donations had allowed them to buy more beds and blankets. I just smiled. Deep down, I knew that I would be the one to push that change forward. Mr. Henderson already had all the documents ready. All that was missing was my signature. On the way home, the afternoon wind messed up my hair, bringing the smell of nearby orange blossoms. I looked up at the sky and thought of Mary. See, my love, I didn't crumble. They took my house, but that just taught me how to build another one. Smaller, simpler, but stronger than ever. I went inside. The room was modest but bright. On the wall hung our wedding photo. On the table, the 2 porcelain teacups. In the yard, the young apple tree. 3 things: memory, love, and life. I didn't need anything else. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Not everyone who loses everything is defeated. Some people only find themselves after they've lost it all." I closed the notebook and turned off the light. In the darkness, I heard the slow, steady rhythm of my heart, the pulse of a man reborn in silence. About 6 months later, when my life had finally settled into a calm rhythm, the old phone rang. The name on the screen was Charles. I stared at it for a long time. Just 7 letters, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. Half a year had passed since they left me with empty hands. I took a deep breath and answered. "Dad, how are you?" His voice was strangely sweet, the kind of sweetness you only use when you need something. "I'm still alive," I answered slowly, living on black coffee and silence. He let out an uncomfortable laugh. "Good to hear." There was a short pause before he said what I already knew was coming. "Dad, I've got a little trouble at the company. I just need a little money to get through a rough patch. As soon as I sign a new contract, I'll pay you back." I laughed, not with bitterness but with a tired lightness. "Have you already forgotten? Son, I have nothing to give. You sold the house. All I have left is my breath." Silence on the other end. I heard a sigh, and then the click of the call ending. I sat there for a while, looking out the window. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the porcelain teacup, making it shine. I ran my fingers along the rim and murmured, "You see, Mary, I told you. When money is the only reason to say the word father, that word stops being a call and becomes a demand." 2 weeks later, Andrew showed up. He didn't call. He didn't warn me. He just appeared at my door. When I opened it, his face showed a certain discomfort, but his eyes shined with calculation. "Dad, I heard you moved." "Yes," I said. "A small house, but big enough to breathe." "And how did you pay for it? I thought you had nothing left." I smiled. "As long as you have a heart, you always have a place to live." He didn't smile. He came inside and started looking around. He scanned every corner, not with nostalgia, but with the look of someone appraising an object. His eyes stopped on the wedding photo hanging on the wall. "You still keep that?" "Yes. You can't sell that photo. Nobody would buy it," I said slowly, letting each word land like a stone. After a bit of small talk, he got to the point. "Dad, do you have any money saved up? I'm just asking." I took a sip of coffee and answered calmly, "Of course I do. But what I save isn't money. It's dignity. And you can't split that." He tensed. He pressed his lips together and said he had to go. Before he left, he muttered, "Are you really not going to help us? After all, we're still your sons." I looked at him for a long time. Son. A father can only help when his child still remembers how to be human. The door closed. In the yard, the young apple tree moved gently in the wind. I sat on the porch. I drank the cold coffee and felt a peace that had no anger in it. I understood that the greatest punishment wasn't my refusal. It was that they had lost the right to call me father from the heart. That night I wrote a letter to Mr. Henderson. I asked him to add a detail to the will. A personal letter, to be read along with it, explaining why I wasn't leaving them a single cent. It wasn't revenge. It was the truth. Before sleeping, I sat on the porch. The night was still. The moon lit up my old, calloused hands. I whispered, "Mary, I don't think I need to give them anything. I just want them to understand, even if it's too late, that what I had left wasn't poverty. It was that they stopped deserving what I had." I closed my eyes, and in the murmur of the wind, I thought I heard someone pronounce my name with tenderness, soft and forgiving. One morning in October, the air was crisp, and the smell of coffee mixed with the damp scent of wood, bringing back memories of the days when Mary was still alive. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. There was something inside me, a soft voice, hers, whispering that it was time to close my pending affairs. I sat at the small wooden table and took out a few yellowed sheets of paper. Beside them, I placed the old fountain pen Mary had given me for my 40th birthday. My hands trembled as I took off the cap. First, I wrote my name, slowly, Arthur Johnson. And then I began to write to my 2 sons, Charles and Andrew, not to scold them, but to say what I hadn't had the courage to say for years. Dear sons, I am not angry. I hold no grudge. Grudges only poison the soul. I'm writing this letter not to punish you, but so you might understand something that money can never teach. Kindness. You sold the house, the place where your mother lived, without knowing that in doing so, you also sold the noblest part of yourselves. I don't blame you. I'm just saddened that, in your hearts, a home became a number. Today, I sign my will, and nothing I have will go to your hands. I know this will anger you, but one day, when you lose something truly valuable, you will understand why your father chose silence. I only leave you one thing, the truth. And the truth is, I was never poor. I just lived simply, to remember that happiness isn't in what you own, but in how you care for what you love. I looked up and saw the wedding photo hanging on the wall. Mary was still smiling. That smile seemed to accompany every word I wrote. I added a few more lines. You left me without a house, but not without a soul. And that, my sons, is something money can never buy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it between the 2 signed copies of the will. Then I called Mr. Henderson to come by. When he arrived, I handed him the envelope and said, "This is the end. When I die, read this in front of them, not to shame them, but so they remember they once had a father who loved them in a different way." Henderson nodded, his eyes moist. He took my hand. "Mr. Johnson, you are the bravest man I've ever known." I smiled. "No, Mr. Henderson. I'm just a father who learned to love with justice, not resignation." When he left, the afternoon wind made the curtains dance. I looked out at the yard. The young apple tree had new leaves, green and tender, like the promise Mary once made me. I closed my eyes and listened to the murmur of the wind. "It's all right, Arthur. You can rest now." I smiled. Inside me, all resentment had dissolved into peace, and I knew that from that moment on, justice would speak for me for the rest of history. After Mr. Henderson left, my little house felt quieter than ever. But it was no longer the heavy silence of that time I was kicked out of my old home. It was the stillness of someone who has completed their mission. I felt each breath lighter, my heart finally without its weight. In the mornings, I continued my routines. Make coffee, water the apple tree, sit on the porch to listen to the birds. The tree's leaves, once tender, now formed a bright green canopy. Every time I looked at it, I thought of Mary. I'd speak in a low voice, as if she were sitting next to me. "See, Mary, the apple tree is still alive, and I still haven't given up." I knew that wherever she was smiling. In the last days of autumn, the air turned cool, and the wind brought the smell of damp earth. I put on Mary's old sweater. It was worn, but wearing it felt like she was hugging me again. In the pocket, I kept the key to our old house, the one object I could never let go of. Sometimes I'd take it out and turn it over in my fingers. The cold metal reminded me of the sound of the lock when she came home from the market. That click had become my memory's music. One afternoon, I visited St. Michael's Cemetery, where Mary rested. The sky was overcast, but a sliver of light fell on the headstones. I brought a bouquet of Gerber daisies and left them by her grave. "I'm finished, Mary," I murmured. "I'm not afraid anymore. Maybe they'll hate me, but one day they'll understand." I stayed there for a long time. The wind moved my hair, and the scent of the flowers mixed with the cold air. I felt her presence behind me, an imaginary hand on my shoulder, and her voice whispering, "You did the right thing." That night I opened my notebook. Only a few pages were left. I wrote a single line. Not all loss is an end. Sometimes it's God's way of letting us start over, without fear. I folded the notebook and placed it next to the wedding photo. The warm light of the lamp lit up our young faces, and it seemed incredible to me that time could pass so quickly while love remained, still, in its place. As night fell, I made another cup of coffee, even though the doctor had forbidden it. I drank it slowly, looking at the streetlight behind the window. A cough, longer than the others, forced me to stop. I felt my body, tired, fragile, but not afraid. Everything was ready. The will, the letter, the instructions for Henderson. Nothing was left pending. I lay back on the bed and listened to the rain tapping on the tin roof. Each drop was a lullaby, taking me back to those ancient nights when Mary and I would listen to the storm, her warm hand in mine. I smiled and closed my eyes. Before I fell asleep, I whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mary. If I don't wake up tomorrow, don't worry. I'll just be coming home." Outside, the rain fell softly, like a farewell, and the little house was wrapped in a quiet, golden light, the light of a life that had finally found peace. The next morning, Mrs. Gable, the owner of the corner store, noticed that the door to my house was still closed. Every day, around 7, she'd see me on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, greeting her with a smile and my usual joke. "This coffee's stronger than I am today, ma'am." But that morning, the porch was empty. The coffee cup was still on the table, still lukewarm, as if time had stopped. Mrs. Gable called my name several times. No answer. Feeling a dark premonition, she asked a young man from the neighborhood to push the door. It wasn't locked. Inside, everything was tidy, as always. Only I was lying on the bed, my hands crossed on my chest, my face at peace. On my chest they found the old key to the previous house, the one I had kept all these years. It was tied with a thin string, placed carefully, like a farewell. On the bedside table my notebook was open to the last page, written in trembling letters. "Don't cry. I've just gone back to where someone is waiting for me." Shaking, Mrs. Gable called Mr. Henderson, whose name was on a paper taped next to the phone. When he arrived and saw me, he took off his hat and bowed his head in silence. He murmured, his voice cracking. He left like someone finishing a melody. "No noise, no regret." They took my body to the small neighborhood chapel. That afternoon the neighbors gathered, in disbelief. No one could believe that the kind old man with the black coffee was gone so suddenly. On the casket, Mr. Henderson placed a bouquet of red Gerber daisies, the same flowers I used to take to Mary at the cemetery. He said with a serene voice, "He left a letter, and a will that I'm sure will leave this small world in silence." The viewing was simple. Neither of my sons appeared. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they didn't care. Only a few neighbors stayed, telling stories about the smiling old man, the morning greeting, the small apple tree he had planted by the porch. An old woman sighed. "He was a good man. God will surely welcome him." Before they closed the casket, Mr. Henderson placed the wedding photo of Mary and me inside, along with the 2 porcelain teacups. He said tenderly, "I'm fulfilling his wish. He wanted to leave with his coffee ready, next to the woman he loved. That afternoon it didn't rain. The gray clouds floated slowly, and the sunlight fell softly on the polished wood of the casket. As they lowered it, a light breeze rustled the leaves of the apple tree in the yard. Its murmur sounded like a farewell. Safe travels, old man. They buried me next to Mary, under the old tree in the cemetery, where every spring small white flowers bloom. There was no music, no weeping, just the wind and the smell of warm earth. They said I left in peace, and I knew it. Somewhere on the other side, Mary was waiting for me. And so, after so many years of carrying the weight of pain, I finally came home. Not to the house that was sold, but to the home of calm, where my wife smiles and offers me, as always, a fresh cup of coffee. The news of my death traveled faster than anyone expected. 2 days later, Charles received a call from Mr. Henderson. His voice was serene. Mr. Arthur Johnson has passed away. As per his wishes, I invite you both to the reading of his will next week. On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence. Charles swallowed and asked, "What did you say? My father died?" "That's correct," Henderson replied. "And he left some things you need to hear. I advise you to come." That same afternoon, Charles called Andrew. They hadn't seen each other in months. They barely exchanged cold texts. Hearing the news, Andrew replied curtly, "Well, it's done. At least now Dad won't be angry with us." Charles let out a nervous laugh with a hint of relief. Angry or not, he must have left something. The house, the land, some account. He couldn't have died with nothing. A week later, the two of them appeared in Henderson's office. They wore black, with dark sunglasses and an air of false solemnity. They didn't ask about the funeral or visit the cemetery. For them, my death was just a necessary transaction to open the next chapter. Henderson greeted them calmly. The office was small. The light fell on the framed diplomas on the wall. On the desk, a sealed envelope awaited them. "Thank you for coming," the lawyer said, his voice firm. "This is your father's last will and testament, signed and legally certified." Charles sat up straighter in his chair, trying to maintain his composure, but his fingers were drumming on the table. Andrew glanced at the envelope and muttered, "They say Dad was richer than we thought." Henderson broke the seal, took out a sheaf of documents, and began to read slowly. "I, Arthur Johnson, being of sound mind, declare this my last will and testament." The two held their breath. Every word sounded like the tick of a clock, including all my savings, bank accounts in Pittsburgh, and the land on the outskirts of town will be donated in their entirety to the St. Jude's Home for the Aged. The air in the room became dense. Charles raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "What did he say? He left everything?" "That's right," Henderson replied. "And he also left a private letter, which he asked to be read in front of you." He opened a second envelope and unfolded a sheet of paper. His voice became slower, deeper. "My sons, if you are hearing this today, it means I am gone. Don't be sad. I left in peace. I left everything to those who know how to value a roof. Because you forgot what it means to have one. Money can be earned again, but trust, once lost, cannot be kept in any bank. I am not punishing you. I just decided to keep living through those who still need a father." When Henderson folded the letter, the room was in absolute silence. Charles was pale. Andrew kept his gaze lowered. Neither said a word. They just looked at each other, with eyes full not only of rage, but of a quiet shame that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The air in the small office grew thick. The only sound was the wall clock. Tick-tock. Mr. Henderson looked up, his gaze firm. "I will read it again, for the record. The entirety of Mr. Arthur Johnson's estate, including his savings accounts, the land, and all cash, has been transferred to the St. Jude's Home. The transaction is complete. It is legal and cannot be contested." Charles slammed his fist on the table. "This can't be. My father had no right. He wasn't in his right mind, Henderson replied calmly. All documents were signed with him in full command of his faculties, with witnesses and a video recording. He came here himself. He signed and said, in his own words, "I want my death to be the beginning for someone else." That sentence made Andrew slump in his chair. "And us?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We're his sons." The lawyer looked at them. His tone softened, but it was still cold. He knew that. And he'd left one final letter with instructions to read it only when you were both present. He opened another envelope. Inside, a yellowed paper, the handwriting shaky but firm. He began to read. "Charles, Andrew, my sons, I know you are angry today. You'll think I was cruel. But perhaps this is the first time I've taught you something with silence. When you sold the house, it didn't hurt me because of the walls or the roof. It hurt because you forgot what your mother taught you. That a home is a place you return to, not something you negotiate. Today I leave everything to the elderly, who no longer have anyone to call them bother. I want them to have the roof that you decided not to keep. If, one day, you manage to understand that, I will forgive you, even if I am no longer here to say it." Henderson finished reading. No one spoke. The wind slipped through the crack in the window, carrying the harsh sound of a truth that was impossible to deny. Charles sank back into his chair. His hands were shaking, his eyes red, but there were no tears. He muttered, "Did he really think we only cared about the money?" Andrew replied in a low voice, a knot in his throat. "And isn't that exactly what we did?" Henderson folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then he said in a measured voice, "He didn't want to hate anyone. Before he died, he asked me to tell you one thing. If they come, tell them their father still loves them, but that he loves them in a way that will force them to remember." Charles stood up. He wanted to speak, but the voice wouldn't come. He turned and walked out into the sun. The light hit him, wiping the pride from his face, leaving only the emptiness of someone who understands. Far too late. Andrew stayed a few seconds more. He looked at the lawyer and whispered, "Did he suffer?" "No. He passed in his sleep, with a smile." Andrew nodded, and the tears finally ran slowly down his face. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time in their lives, they both understood that justice doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes all it takes is a piece of paper and a steady heart. A week after the reading of the will, the news of the huge donation from an unknown old man spread through the city. The local newspaper ran a discreet but solemn headline. "The St. Jude's Home receives the donation of a lifetime from Arthur Johnson, the man who turned pain into kindness." Accompanying the article was a photograph of a new, shining bronze plaque placed at the entrance of the home, in memory of Arthur Johnson, who turned betrayal into hope. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone gently and the wind swayed the tops of the trees. Mr. Wallace, the director of the home, stood in front of the residence, his voice trembling but full of emotion. "There are people who don't need big words. They just do what's right, in silence. Starting today, this kitchen will bear the name of Mr. Johnson, the man who left his warmth for us." The elderly residents applauded, some laughing, others wiping away tears. The newly renovated kitchen gleamed with clean yellow walls. On the shelves, porcelain teacups shined in the sun. Mr. Wallace picked one up and murmured, "I bet he liked his coffee black too, just like me." That same day, Mr. Henderson arrived with an envelope containing Arthur Johnson's last words. "Don't let anyone feel forgotten, as I once felt. If you can, plant an apple tree in the yard. It will give shade, and it will be a reminder that no matter how many times you cut it down, it always grows back." And so, in a corner of the garden, they planted a young apple tree. Weeks later, it took root, and the first buds appeared. Every morning, when the sun came up, The residents would sit around it, drinking coffee and telling stories about Old Man Arthur, the man they never knew, but who felt like an old friend. Mr. Wallace told Henderson he didn't just leave us money. He left us the certainty that kindness can bloom again, even in the soil of betrayal. Henderson nodded. I think he's finally at peace. That afternoon, the chapel bells rang softly. Under the orange light of sunset, the small apple tree cast a long shadow on the stone path. Some said that when the wind blew, the leaves of the tree whispered with the voice of Mary, the wife he called, "My dear Mary." Inside the dining room hung a photograph of Arthur and Mary, a copy Henderson had brought, with an inscription beneath it. True love is not inherited, it is honored. As night fell, the warm light from the kitchen spilled out the windows, illuminating the apple tree as it moved in the breeze. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. There, no one spoke of betrayal. Everyone remembered a father who had answered in dignity with kindness. And so, the legacy of justice no longer rested in a safe deposit box or in legal documents. It was in every smile of those elderly people with a roof over their heads, who, without knowing it, had learned from a man who lost everything how to believe in humanity again. One evening, in his luxurious downtown apartment, Charles was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, just like every other day. His life was not the same. The company had gone bankrupt after several risky deals. Debts were drowning him, and his wife had left, taking their young son. The apartment, full of expensive objects, but empty of soul, felt like a lifeless museum. The TV was on, but no one was watching. He was about to change the channel when a local news story made him stop. Today, the St. Jude's Home inaugurated a new wing, built thanks to the total donation of Mr. Arthur Johnson, a man who, upon his death, gave his entire estate to help the abandoned elderly. Charles froze. On the screen, the image of a young apple tree appeared, green and bright, in the middle of a courtyard. Old people were laughing, and in the corner a plaque showed the words Henderson had read, in memory of Arthur Johnson, who turned betrayal into hope. His blood ran cold. He set the remote down, leaning back on the sofa, his gaze fixed on the screen. The anchor continued. It said that Mr. Johnson lost everything after being betrayed by his own sons, but that he died in peace, donating his fortune without holding any grudge. The applause from the report echoed in the empty room. Charles felt his chest tighten. The image of his father, sitting at the old wooden table, stirring his coffee in silence, came back to him, sharp and clear. He remembered the phrase he himself had said years ago when he'd first tried to sell the house. It's just bricks and shingles. A wave of remorse hit him. He put his hands to his head, his voice breaking. Forgive me, Dad. Please. On the other side of the city, Andrew was watching the same report. He was living alone, unemployed, his own marriage broken. When he heard that, thanks to the donation, dozens of elderly people now had a roof and warmth, he lowered his head to the table, and tears began to fall. He thought of strangers, he whispered between sobs, and we forgot our own father. The two brothers in different places cried at the same time. No one saw them. No one comforted them. From a nearby church, the bells began to ring slowly, mixing with the echo of their weeping. Charles stood up and searched in a drawer for the envelope Henderson had given them at the reading of the will. He opened it and, for the first time, read the letter with attention. At the very end, his father's shaky handwriting said, "If one day you come to understand, plant the apple tree again. It doesn't have to be in the yard. It's enough that it grows in your heart." He fell to his knees, and his tears soaked the paper. The last ray of sunset lit up the writing, as if his father were still speaking to him. That evening, Charles went out onto his balcony with a pot in his hands. He added soil. He planted a small apple sapling he had bought on the way home. When he finished, he looked up at the sky and murmured, "I understand now, Dad." A soft breeze moved the tender leaves of the tree. Under the golden light of dusk, the murmur of the leaves sounded like a quiet laugh. The laugh of a father who, even from far away, forg. The dawn at the St. Jude's home was soft that day. The golden light came through the windows and reflected off the bronze plaque with my name, making the letters shine like they were freshly polished. Arthur Johnson, who turned betrayal into hope. The elderly residents were gathered around the wooden table, drinking coffee. On the wall, the photo of Mary and me was still there, simply framed, cleaned and cared for every morning. In the yard, the apple tree I asked them to plant stood strong, giving shade to the stone bench. The first small green fruits were beginning to form. As he watered it, Mr. Wallace murmured, "He was right. Everything good needs time to bloom." An old woman nearby nodded with a sweet smile. He never left. He just moved to a place where he can see us better. The morning wind moved through the garden, making the leaves of the apple tree sing with a happy, almost young sound. In that place, no one spoke of loss. They only remembered a father who had left his faith in the act of giving. Far away from there, in the city, Charles carried a bouquet of white flowers to St. Michael's Cemetery. Andrew was already waiting for him, with dark circles under his eyes. The two stood for a long time in front of the twin graves of Arthur and Mary. Green grass grew between the headstones, and the wind carried a faint smell of coffee. Charles placed the bouquet down and said, his voice trembling, "Dad, we're here." Andrew, his eyes wet, added, "We didn't bring anything, just an apology." They stood in silence. In the distance, the church bells rang slowly, marking the rhythm of forgiveness. Charles leaned down, touched the cold stone, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching us, even after you were gone." When they left the cemetery, the sun was high. At the gate, a boy was selling small plants. Charles looked down and saw several apple trees in small pots. He bought 2 and handed one to Andrew. "For Dad," he said softly, "one for the yard at St. Jude's, and one for home." Andrew nodded, his lips trembling. They parted in opposite directions, each carrying his pot, as if carrying a piece of recovered memory. That same afternoon, at the St. Jude's home, Mr. Wallace went out to the garden and saw 2 men kneeling next to the old apple tree, planting a new one. They didn't say a word. They just placed their hands on the damp earth and remained in silence. Mr. Wallace didn't ask who they were. He just smiled and said, "Welcome home." As the sun set, the shadows of the 2 apple trees merged on the ground. The murmur of the wind mixed with the laughter of the residents. And somewhere in the orange glow, the figures of Arthur and Mary seemed to be sitting next to each other, smiling in silence as they watched the world go on. Because in the end, justice isn't punishment. It's the moment when pain turns into kindness, and people learn to come back, not to reclaim what was lost, but to understand that the love, in reality, never left. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To hear the next story, click the box on the left of your screen. Thank you for watching.